My name's Abby. I want to welcome you all here to the Smurfit Stone Superfund Site info session. I'm with MontPIRG, and here with me is Maria, Jack, Ava, and Courtney. Today we're just going to give out a little bit of information about Smurfit Stone, and we have some super special guests here with us. With us today we have the Montana representatives of the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as a Montana representative of the DEQ, and two representatives from the Frenchtown Community Advisory Group. Before these guys get talking to us, we're going to give a 15-minute presentation just to give some history around Smurfit Stone, talk a little bit about the contaminants, and tell you guys a little bit about MontPIRG. But before we get into that, we would love to honor and respect the original stewards of the land here in Montana. As students here at MontPIRG, the work we do is directly tied to the land that we now call Montana. We acknowledge the original stewards of the land within its boundaries who were forcibly removed from their original homelands, and we are committed to action to rectify this injustice. At MontPIRG, we acknowledge the Salish, Pend Oreille, Kootenai, Blackfeet, Crow, Ojibwe, Assiniboine, Sioux, Little Chippewa, Northern Cheyenne, Shoshone Bannock, Eastern Bannock, Brabant, Plains Cree, Nez Perce, and Coeur d'Alene tribes and bands who cared for this land and or the land around us for generations. We acknowledge that we live on stolen land and benefit from settler colonialism, and we celebrate and honor the resilience of these tribes as the descendants of those forcibly removed still remain here. They are community members, students, professors, advocates, and friends. We are guests on the land, and we thank the tribes for all their contributions to our community, culture, and environment, both past and present. We recognize that an acknowledgement is only the first step of restorative justice. Thus, we are committed to action. This means we will continuously learn more about the cultures of Native Montanans, advocate for decolonization of higher education, help in the work to prevent identity-based harm and violence, advocate to protect the rights and enfranchisement of Indigenous peoples, and collaborate with Indigenous peoples wherever possible in our advocacy work. We want to empower you to join us in our mission to create tangible, positive change. On that same note, I just wanted to acknowledge the impacts of colonization on Superfund sites, specifically on Smurfit Stone as well. Ideals within colonialism, such as capitalism, overconsumption, and ownership of the natural world lead to sites like this happening, and environmental harm. The intentional keeping Indigenous peoples off the table is very harmful, and it's vital that we start inviting Indigenous peoples to the table and begin to listen and learn more than we have. With that, I'd like to invite Maria to the stage just to talk a little bit about MontPIRG.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah, I just like to go a little bit into what MontPIRG is. So MontPIRG stands for Montana Public Interest Research Group. We are a student-run, nonpartisan advocacy organization with chapters at UM and MSU. We provide hands-on experience working on real public interest issues that affect our communities. Some past examples of work we've done was our Power 101 session, our 2025 Municipal Candidate Forum, and our tenant advocacy training, and much more. Next, I'd like to talk about some student work related to Smurfit Stone. As you might notice, there should be some zines on your table. These zines provide information about Superfund sites and anything related to Smurfit Stone. So if you are confused throughout the presentation, please feel free to look through those zines. We have also created stickers, which are available at the table near the entrance. We created a public outreach proposal. We continue to work on relationship building. And lastly, we have our info session that we've been working on this whole semester. Thank you. I'd like to introduce now Jack to talk about what the Smurfit Stone Superfund Site is. Thank you.
So, we've been hearing the words Smurfit Stone Superfund Site, a lot of S's, a lot, and what it is essentially a former pulp mill and paper mill site near Frenchtown, about 11 miles northwest of Missoula. It is a massive site, about 3,200 acres on historic floodplain. The mill operated from 1957 to 2010. The mill and its operations knowingly contaminated the river, and the site had a very long history of protests over labor and environmental concerns. So, for a bit of a timeline, before any of this, and this is very important, in 1855 there was the Hellgate Treaty, which gave legal precedence and representation for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And that treaty also guaranteed the tribes the right to hunt and fish at their accustomed places, which do run along the Clark Fork. That's very important to remember as we talk about the site and its contamination of the river. Anyways, 1957, the mill itself opens and begins operation. As early as 1958, fish kills and foamy water are observed downstream of the site. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, there were a lot of environmental protests involving the site in and of itself. The Missoula County of Health Department ordered the mill to add aeration basins and wastewater storage ponds. These ponds are still there to this day. They are unlined, and the mill was still permitted to release wastewater into the river during high water periods in spring, such as May and June. In 2009, the mill announced its closure, and in 2011, M2 Green bought most of the site for redevelopment. This was a sort of exciting time. Originally, there were a lot of plans proposed for what the site could end up being once cleaned up, but those plans have not yet really come to fruition. In 2012, that was when the initial EPA testing began. In 2015, that was the Environmental Protection Agency's administrative order on consent, in which the EPA named M2 Green, West Rock, and International Paper as potentially responsible parties. Now, a potentially responsible party in this instance refers essentially to a party that is at least partially responsible for the contamination of the site and or the testing and cleanup of the site. The EPA oversaw the remedial investigation associated therewith, although these potentially responsible parties are, at last I saw written, a combined $750,000 behind on federal taxes, and therefore they really have not been able to fund these things the way that they should be. In 2017, the Community Advisory Group formed. We're happy to have representatives from there now. And essentially up to this day, the EPA has continued with testing around the site, although the process has been very difficult and has been taking a long time. So, why is Smurfit Stone considered a Superfund site? Well, the mill produced pulp for cardboard products, and it used very harsh chemicals in the process. Waste from that process was left behind in these landfills and storage ponds. So Montana itself has a lot of Superfund sites. This is a map of all of the Superfund sites in Montana. You can see Frenchtown there, just downstream from Missoula. And for a proportion of how many Superfund sites there are in Montana per millions of people, there's Montana. It's quite a lot of Superfund sites. So now with a little bit more information on what sort of chemicals are there and what the threat is to people and the environment, my colleague Ava is going to come up and talk a little bit about that.
Hi, so I am going to be talking about the contaminants on the site and why they should concern you. So some samples from the site have shown dioxins and furans. These contaminants are both hydrophobic, which means they bind to fats and they don't break down easily in water. This is important because unlike a blood sample, where you can get all the information from one test, to understand all of the contaminants at this site, it is necessary to take multiple samples from multiple different spots on the site to truly get the full picture of what the contaminants are on the site and how much there are. So, some other contaminants at the site include PCBs, manganese, and arsenic. These chemicals are all harmful to people, showing links to cancer, and harmful to wildlife and the environment. These contaminants not only harm the current environment, but they also move throughout the food chain. So what I have here is a flood risk assessment, and this is where the Smurfit Stone paper mill is built, and then this is the Clark Fork, and the red and the blue shows the regular flow of the Clark Fork. This area right here is all the ponds that hold the contaminants from the site. So because the site is built so close to the river, if there was a future flood, it would take out all the contaminants from these ponds and wash them downstream, which would negatively impact many communities. A future flood is very likely to happen, and it's very likely to happen soon due to climate change. Because the sites have so many contaminants, this would cause irreversible damage to the environment. Not only are we worried about a potential flood, even without a flood occurring, contaminants are already seeping into the groundwater, and there are worries that the berms that are holding the contaminants back right now are slowly degrading. So now I'm going to introduce Courtney to talk about why stakeholder perspectives matter.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to just go over my research that kind of got us here to the proposal that we developed this fall. So my research is grounded in my graduate work on stakeholder perspectives in the Smurfit Stone cleanup. My work examines how different stakeholders involved in or affected by the site understand concepts such as risk, responsibility, trust, and what constitutes as a successful cleanup. One of my biggest findings across my research is that environmental cleanup cases is that conflict is not always about the facts alone. It's often about the differences in how people interpret uncertainty, how they define safety, and whether they feel heard and represented in the decision-making process. In other words, environmental justice is not only about the outcomes, it's about the process. Who has access to the information, how that information is communicated, and how institutions respond to community concerns all shape whether the cleanup feels legitimate. And this is just some of our goals that helped us develop this collaboration proposal this fall that led to this event. And so tonight's event is meant to help us better understand the relationships and roles that shape the Superfund cleanup process and serve as a model of procedural environmental justice. We have representatives who can speak to federal and state oversights, structures, and we also have community engagement pathways and representatives to speak about that. My hope is that this creates a clear picture of where decisions happen, what constraints exist, and where public input can be the most meaningful. All right, so next we're hearing from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA is the federal agency responsible for managing the Superfund process, and this includes site investigation, risk assessment, choosing remedies, enforcement, and ensuring long-term protection afterwards. Joining us from the EPA tonight are Mackenzie Meter and Allie Archer.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me in the back? Yeah. Good. This is a nice sound system. I didn't expect that to be a thumbs up. Well, first of all, I want to say great job, everyone. It's a huge topic and a lot of tedious facts and history, and so I think taking that on is really impressive, and thanks for bringing this group together and the panel. So just want to first say thank you guys did a really good job trying to understand decades of history and Superfund process. My name is Allie Archer. I am the remedial project manager for Smurfit Stone. I have been with EPA for 11 years now and have been on Smurfit since 2019, going on 7 years. My background is in biological and environmental engineering, and I went from grad school to Peace Corps. It's Peace Corps week, so I didn't have to put that out there if anyone has questions about that afterwards. And I'm joined up here with Mackenzie Meter. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, Mackenzie Meter. I'm the Community Involvement Coordinator for this site and a good handful of others, generally in Western Montana. I've been with EPA for about 3 years. Before that, I was a grad student at University of Michigan. I got a degree from them in 2023 in environmental policy and had a focus on behavior and the environment as well. So risk communication stuff is always pretty interesting to me too.
Awesome. All right, we are going to talk about the federal agency of EPA's role in Superfund. And I want to start by seeing if anyone can answer, what was the first Superfund site in the United States? Yes.
Love Canal, New York.
Good job. Yes, correct. So Love Canal is the site of Hooker Chemical Company, which operated for about a decade in the 1940s. They dumped all of their chemicals into Love Canal. The canal was then covered up, and Hooker Chemicals sold the site for $1 to the city of Niagara Falls. Homes and schools were then built on Love Canal, and in the decades following, a lot of health issues were reported from that community. There was a state of emergency declared in 1978, and as a result of that, in 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, which we will call CERCLA, but it's also known as Superfund. CERCLA provides the authority and funding for the federal government, or EPA, to respond to the release or threat of release of hazardous substances. So this is what started all in the 1980s. As a result of CERCLA, EPA developed the National Oil and Hazardous Substance Pollution Contingency Plan, very wordy. It's the NCP, and it basically provides the organizational structure by which we implement Superfund. And I'm going to talk about it right now because that's literally our relationship to Superfund and our role in the process. And I actually brought my CERCLA and NCP with me. I bring it a lot of places because it is the guidebook, the rule book by which my job and all cleanups occur. It describes community involvement in there, which Mackenzie will talk about too. So it is a law, and we have a set of regulations and guidance by which we implement that law. And it provides a lot of comfort because we have our job kind of laid out for us. If you're a student and you already had a rule book on how to be a great student, then it's kind of easy, you know the next steps that happen. That's the same with CERCLA. There's not a lot of wiggle room, but it's all laid out and it ticks through what we have to do to get to a cleanup. So we're going to go into a little more detail about that. First of all, I want to talk about what are the goals of Superfund. So what are we trying to do out there when we list a site or propose a site to the national priorities list? Number one, and this is EPA's mission too, is to protect human health and the environment. And in Superfund, it's by cleaning up contaminated sites. We also make responsible parties pay for cleanup work. As Jack talked about, we have responsible parties out at Smurfit. They are West Rock, International Paper, and West 2 Green. We have them under an order to pay for all of the investigation, all of the sampling, and all of the oversight costs of both the federal and state folks who work on the site. So we call it a polluter pays policy, but we have people in EPA who work in enforcement and attorneys who help get former operators or owners of these contaminated sites under order to complete this cleanup. We also are required, and it's a goal, to meaningfully involve communities in the Superfund process. And ultimately, our goal is to return sites to productive use. And that's something that was brought up earlier. It's front of mind for a lot of folks is what's happening out at Smurfit, what's the update for Frenchtown, when are we going to get it cleaned up, or what are the next steps? So the end goal for EPA is to return these sites to productive use. What is EPA's role at Superfund sites? So more specifically, we are the lead agency on federal Superfund sites. So there are also state Superfund sites, but what Jack pulled up and the sites across Montana, those are federal Superfund sites, and in CERCLA, the president delegated authority to EPA to conduct and oversee the work on Superfund sites. So what we do is we determine the scope of work. We're figuring out how much sampling needs to be done, what's the timeline. We provide technical oversight out there. So if there's field work happening, EPA, the state, or our contractors are out overseeing the work being done. We also ultimately are required and in charge of selecting the final cleanup. So we select the remedy, and that's put forward in a record of decision. We, like I said earlier, we require potentially responsible parties to pay for cleanup work, and that's at private sites. There's also something called fund lead sites, and that's where Superfund as kind of the funding mechanism comes into play, and we have a Superfund to pay for fund lead sites. And then we also lead community engagement efforts as the lead agency on federal Superfund sites. It got copied over a little weird, and I know it's very wordy, but I wanted to talk about what is the job of a remedial project manager. And as I said earlier, this is actually dictated in the NCP. So I pulled up the Part 300, Section 120, and it lists all these as the requirements for my job on Superfund sites. So I have direct response efforts and coordinate all other efforts. So incredibly broad and all-consuming, but basically it falls to me to direct and coordinate all efforts on a Superfund site. I'm also the prime contact, and that's listed in the NCP under the law that I have to be the prime contact for federal Superfund sites. It's also my responsibility to coordinate, direct, and review the work plans of all of their agencies, responsible parties, contractors. It's in order to ensure compliance with the law and the NCP, and make sure we're following the administrative orders and work plans. Based upon all those documents, I get all that information, I distill it, and then I recommend action for decision by our lead agency official. So for a final cleanup decision, for example, I recommend that, and then EPA's regional administrator ultimately will sign the record of decision. And then finally, participate in all decision-making processes necessary to ensure compliance with the NCP. So for those who are future scientists, attorneys, chemists, biologists, there's a place for you on Superfund sites. We have a large site team that's both our project manager, but also we have attorneys, toxicologists, we have public relations folks, so it's not just an RPM who makes these decisions, it's ultimately me coordinating with a team of experts, but it comes down to the RPM to pass that decision along and be the ultimate communicator. I believe I pass it off to a huge part of the team as well.
Hello again, everybody. How are we doing? So far, so good? Okay. No, it's a lot of information. I think so, yeah, we're good on time? Very good. Okay, so on the community involvement front, so you see these bullets on here. One of the biggest things is making sure that we're engaging the community and in an early stage of the process. I know that the Smurfit site has been under investigation for about 10 years, so it doesn't seem like it's in an early stage of the process, but it is actually still in the first stage of the process after initial assessment. As was discussed, there is a lot of work that goes into building those sampling plans, going out there, and then honestly just understanding all of that data. It takes more time than you would imagine. So as part of all of this, it's trying to keep the public well informed of ongoing and planned activities, encouraging public involvement, listening carefully, and encouraging the implementation of a wide range of community involvement activities, just to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible. So that looks like a lot of different things. That's sending out newsletters, like things I can do from my desk in Helena are sending out newsletters, keeping the website updated, making sure contact information is front and center. But then there's also things like this. There's attending PEG meetings. There's all kinds of outreach events and local community gathering spaces like breweries. Just as an example, there's just quite a bit that can be done, because realistically, if you look in our guidelines and what sort of mandates our roles and responsibilities, there's very little. There are about 4 things, 4 community engagement activities that are required at this stage of the process, but that's just, we don't get into this work so we can do the bare minimum. We get into it because we care a lot about the environment, and we want to work in a space that allows us to live our passions and also do meaningful, impactful work. So to that end, one of those mandatory engagement activities is saying, hey, there's money available for technical assistance, or hey, here's where you can look at documents. But I mean, that's just checking a box. If I did that, that would be kind of boring, and that would make my job very boring. So again, to that extent, there's quite a bit more that we go out and do, and it's never just me. Allie's a champion. She's been on the site for 7 years, and I've just been along for the ride for about 3 of those. So that's community involvement in the broadest sense. These are just a couple examples of some of the things that we create. This is one side of the fact sheet, a few of which I have with me tonight, so if any of you are curious about some other details related to the site, contaminants, when it was listed, what an administrative order on consent is, all of that. That's all in there. And then this is an example of a flyer that we'll place in the Frenchtown School District newsletter. We try to do that monthly, but with the slow process of Superfund, sometimes there's just not as much to report out, which I would love it if it was just a wild ride all the time, but unfortunately we do have to be patient sometimes. I'm just going to go over some coordination requirements quickly. So I heard earlier, Jack, I think it might have been in your piece of the presentation. I'm sorry if I'm mistaking who was speaking. It was a lot of very good information. Coordination is also legally required with our natural resource trustees, CSKT being one of them, but it also includes U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Montana NRDP, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. BLM, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the Kalispel Tribe. So that is required. But again, we like to overachieve. We like to go above and beyond. So we convene the Frenchtown Working Group, which includes all of those above, as well as members of the CAG. And I think it was actually in response to, there was some feedback given that like, hey, these technical groups, these technical working group meetings feel really inaccessible, like it's not fair that we're not invited. Totally agree. So we opened them up last year, 2 years ago. Time flies. Missoula County, Clark Fork Coalition, and Trout Unlimited all sit on that working group as well, and have what appear to me to be pretty productive conversations about data and some of the more technical aspects of the site. So again, there's that breakout between what's required and then the other things that we engage with on the site, and we're always learning and always trying to listen and hear where we can do better. So it's also activities and events like this that help us understand where we can connect the dots better. I think I'm passing back over to Allie. Nope.
Holding questions till the end.
Holding questions till the end. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mackenzie and Allie, for that. Next, we will be hearing. Yeah, you guys can clap. All right, and then next we will be hearing from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. The DEQ plays an important state oversight and coordination role in the contaminated site work. Our DEQ speaker is Brianna Paps, who serves as the Montana DEQ Superfund Project Officer.
Thank you. Thanks everyone again for coming out tonight. It's awesome to see such a great turnout. So I am the project manager for the Department of Environmental Quality for the Smurfit Stone Site. And I've been in my current role for the last about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was working in the private sector doing environmental consulting work, and my background is in chemical and bioengineering. I'm originally from Great Falls and have lived in Missoula after graduating college for a bit, so I'm excited to get to work on this project. And I'm just going to kind of go through who DEQ is, how we're involved in the Superfund process, and specifically what we do for Smurfit Stone. So the DEQ are the Department of Environmental Quality, is the agency that I work for. Our mission is to champion a healthy environment for a thriving Montana, and we do this by ensuring that Montanans have access to clean air, water, and land. So this fits in really well with the goals of Superfund cleanup, and it's also why I like my job and enjoy what I get to do each day, because I feel strongly about our mission. Our agency has 3 divisions. One is air, energy, and mining. One is water quality. And then waste management and remediation is the division that I work for, and that's what Superfund falls under. So we have a whole section dedicated to federal Superfund sites. As was mentioned, there are 20 Superfund sites in the state, about 20. and I am the project manager for 3 of them, one of which is the Smurfit site. So I'll talk about the state's role in Superfund. Our role is also defined in the Superfund law, as Ali mentioned. So we commonly call that CERCLA, or just shortened to Superfund, but that encourages state involvement in EPA-led cleanups. Ali also talked a little bit about the National Contingency Plan, but that's kind of the blueprint of how we implement Superfund law, and that specifically states that EPA shall ensure meaningful and substantial involvement of the state. So that state authority is delegated to the Department of Environmental Quality. And we have cooperative agreements with EPA that outlines our consultative role. So on the Smurfit site, EPA is the lead agency, and then DEQ is the support agency. So we have these cooperative agreements that kind of outline specifically how we fill that consultative role, and it also is the mechanism that provides us funding from EPA and at this site from the PRPs. So then specifically what we do at Smurfit, a lot of my role is reviewing and providing comments on the documents related to Superfund. So this graphic kind of shows the timeline of the Superfund process, or the various steps of the process. And each step is really documented and outlined in very specific reports. So that's a big part of our role, is just reviewing those documents to make sure that we agree with what they're saying and understand what is happening at each step. So we're currently in the orange box, the characterization box, which is also the remedial investigation and feasibility study stage. So that is a fairly close to the beginning. So we're still at the beginning of the process. But at this stage, we're looking at defining where our contaminants are, doing a lot of sampling to figure out what our contaminants of concern are, looking at risk. So at this stage, a lot of the documents that we've been reviewing are those work plans that outline what we're sampling for, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. Once we have done a sampling event, we'll get a report called a data summary report, which outlines what the data is showing us. It's kind of a summary of all the data that's been collected. So that's another thing that we'll review to make sure we're understanding what the data is showing to help us determine what the next steps are. And at this stage, a really big document that should be coming up soon is called the Remedial Investigation Report. So that's where we're going to summarize all the sampling that's been done over the past 10 years and get kind of that comprehensive idea of what is it showing us, what are the things that we need to address as we go into the next steps. I also mentioned reviewing site data, so that's when we get those data summary reports. I'll look at the data to kind of get an idea of what it's showing and how that could impact our site understanding. I also participate in the various site meetings. So we have a lot of meetings with EPA where we're just trying to get on the same page and talk about next steps. I also meet regularly with the responsible parties along with EPA to just kind of do site planning and scheduling and talk about what sampling is coming up. Also are involved with a lot of the community involvement things that Mackenzie mentioned, like we attend the CAG meetings, we'll attend some of the brewery meetings as well, and things like this, because I think that's a really important part of the process. And then another aspect is getting out on site and observing the field work. So whenever we're doing a sampling event, I will go out on site and just make sure the sampling that's happening is the sampling that we think is supposed to be happening. And another aspect of that is doing site inspections or berm inspections. We'll go out in the summer months and just walk the site and make sure the berms look good, there's not any flood risk out there. Under Superfund law, the state has a few unique actions, one of which is identifying the state-specific requirements that the remedy must meet. So a cool part of Superfund is it also takes into account our state laws. So as a state agency, we get to identify those state laws that we think the remedy needs to meet, like our groundwater protection standards. We also get to provide concurrence, partial concurrence, or non-concurrence on the record of decision. So the record of decision is that document that outlines how the site's going to be cleaned up. And it is kind of a big deal if we don't concur with the record of decision, and that's something that we work really closely with EPA to make sure we are on the same page when we get to that record, that we do feel comfortable with the remedy that's being proposed. So that's an important part of the process that we get to be involved in. And it also requires state concurrence for a site to be delisted. So after a site has been cleaned up and it's been determined that no more action needs to take place, it can be delisted, but the state has to also agree that we feel like the site has been adequately cleaned up and is no longer a risk. And I also want to mention that we do have technical assistance. So in our co-op agreement, we have funding for technical assistance. So we work with a local company called Haley & Aldrich. Well, they have an office in Missoula. And they provide me technical support for various things like data evaluation, document review. They also are able to go out and observe field work if I'm not able to make it over from Helena, because they are so local, which is great. And then they have a lot of technical experts that I can tap into. They have risk assessors, chemists, all of the varieties of scientists, so they're a great resource for me to help as I am involved in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna. Next, we will hear from the Frenchtown Community Advisory Group, more commonly referred to as the CAG. The CAG provides a consistent forum for community members to learn about the cleanup, ask questions, and bring forward concerns and priorities the community faces. It also supports two-way communication by helping agencies understand what issues matter most locally. Tonight, we're joined by Jerry Dellis and Jen Harrington, who will speak about the CAG's relationship with Smurfit Stone. Jerry and Jen are both part of the Frenchtown Smurfit Stone CAG and serve as part of the CAG admin team. Jerry Dellis is a Frenchtown resident herself and has been involved with the CAG since its origin in 2017. So next we will hear from Jerry.
I'm going to leave my coat on because I'm absolutely freezing to death. Sorry. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you all for coming. We really appreciate these opportunities to talk about how you can engage with the community advisory group, and it gives you a real flavor of who you would be hearing from and working with. So we're here to make that an easy way for you to become involved as well. So the Frenchtown Smurfit Stone Community Advisory Group, commonly known as the CAG, is a community body inside a federal Superfund cleanup process, and that is the former Smurfit Stone mill site. So the CAG was formed in 2017. Under the federal Superfund law, EPA is required to involve the community. When we first started out in 2017, there was what's called a community involvement plan, which is also required by the EPA to do. So there was extensive work done in the community by the EPA, interviews asking about how they wanted communication done, what they envisioned the site of. And it's really something that the Frenchtown residents had a say in way back in 2017. That was a community involvement plan that was, again, a requirement by EPA. So Frenchtown residents formed the CAG to ensure involvement would be ongoing, it would be public, it would be informed, and it would be structured. So our mission is to serve as a trusted liaison between the community, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality by becoming informed, sharing this information with the public, and engaging in the Superfund process to ensure the restoration of the former Smurfit Stone mill site to a healthy ecological state for future generations. So that's how we're really, that's our mission statement. It's our guiding values and vision for what we do. What liaison means in practice, it means that we receive technical updates from the EPA. It engages regularly with Montana DEQ. We review and discuss sampling and monitoring data. We ask clarifying questions in a public forum. We share information with the broader community, and we don't make decisions. We ensure the process is understandable and visible. And I think one of the things that you'll take away from here is that, oh my gosh, what in the world, that is so complicated. And it is complicated, it's very technical. And having been part of that for almost 10 years now, I can tell you, I don't have a scientific background, but I feel like I can talk a little scientific if I need to. It's kind of funny when I do. The working relationship, EPA is the lead federal agency responsible for investigation and remedy selection. Montana DEQ is the state level oversight and active CAG participation. Haley and Aldrich, as Brianna said, is the technical consulting firm assisting DEQ with data review. They come to our meetings as well. The CAG provides the consistent public forum where these relationships intersect. Consistency matters. Superfund cleanups are multi-phase and they're long-term, often decades. When Brianna showed that slide of where we are, that orange block could take 2 years. And it's likely that it will take 2 years. There's tens of thousands of pages of documents and testing that is being looked at right now, tens of thousands of pages. And so when we get it, it's been poured over by Haley and Aldrich, by DEQ, by EPA. And so it's really, it is very, it's a lot. Agency personnel do rotate over time. I think we've been through we've been through a lot of different people, which happens in every way. Technical data evolves. The CAG has met monthly since 2017. This is something we're really proud of. We continued meeting during COVID via Zoom, and we all shared information, and we were all at the table because there was a lot going on then. There was things that were reported on, and we stayed engaged and involved. Where we're at now, we've seen this, it's site investigation, it's groundwater monitoring, risk assessment, feasibility study, upcoming record of decision, and as I said, when we're at the stage we're at now, getting to that upcoming record of decision is probably, I'd say, a minimum 2 years-ish, more-ish. Ish means plus or minus. It's a way to cover yourself. So the record of decision will select the cleanup remedy and the long-term management approach to the site. Community engagement happens at the CAG. It's the first Thursday of every month at 6 o'clock at the Frenchtown Fire Station. We have a Zoom option available. Look at our Facebook page. We post the agendas. My contact information is on there. We're in the Frenchtown school newsletter where Jen's contact information, my contact information, it's all there. If you ever have any questions about, well, how can I get involved and whatever, we're here to help engage with that. If anybody in here has a group that you're involved with at school, outside of this, if you ever want the CAG to come and present what we do, how we do it, and how you can be involved, please get in touch with me. It means a lot to us. We don't get funding. We're all volunteers. We can't make big flyers. We can't have a big website. We're just a community involvement or community advisory group. And so getting out and engagements like this are really important to us to help educate people about coming to CAG meetings and how you can become involved. So thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And just as she said, you can come to a CAG meeting. There's one this Thursday, the 5th, from 6 to 8. And we'd love to see all of you there. That's how I got involved in this process. I started attending CAG meetings and interviewed stakeholders, and here we are now. All right, so next we're going to be hearing from Jen Harrington. She is a professor here at the university, and She has plenty of experience working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous stakeholders.
Jen Harrington, Indigenous. My name is Jen Harrington. I'm an enrolled member of the Turtlemont Chippewa tribe in north central North Dakota, but I grew up here in Missoula Valley and have lived my life on the north side, where there was one of the many Superfund sites here in Missoula, the White Pine and Sash site. And that was one of the first engagements I was part of in understanding. Of course, it provided jobs for the people of the community, but it also was adding harm to the health of the human health and the environment. So I came here and I got my degrees, undergrad and graduate degrees, and my graduate work was understanding tribal consultation. Is it happening? Is it working? How effective is it? And specifically a case study with the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes as a tribal trust resource, from their perspective, what's this process been like? We are on the homelands of the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, and at the center of the tribal culture is a deeply ingrained ethic of a reciprocity between people and the land. So when suggestions come up is that we have to develop this site right away, I would just say, step back and say, what would the tribes agree with that? Maybe it's time for this land to rest, just as an alternative perspective. So the Hellgate Treaty is an important part of why the tribes are involved, that they have the right to be involved in anything that's in their Aboriginal territories. The treaty, of course, was plagued with translation issues, intentional conflict, and non-Indian goals from the tribe's perspective was to claim lands and resources. And Isaac Stevens, who was the territorial governor, really wanted to just obtain the land, especially in the Bitterroot Valley, from the Salish. Within the Hellgate Treaty, Article 3 gives the exclusive right of taking fish in all streams running through and bordering the reservation, and is further secured of taking fish in all usual and accustomed places, which means the Clark Fork River, which requires that the fish and the habitat are healthy and clean. So the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, as have been mentioned, are natural resource trustees for the site, but across their Aboriginal territories. In 1957, when Waldorf Paper began looking at land along the Clark Fork River to establish this craft paper mill, in 1957, they did not consult with the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes about the potential impacts to land and water resources. So in 1957, prior to the mill being developed, two scientists in the area, Whitney and Spindler, went to understand what would be the impact. Let's understand what's here first. So they found that roughly 50%, or 765 organisms, were intolerant of pollution. 7 months after the mill started their operations, that percent of sensitive organisms dropped to 17%. So there was immediate impact to the health of the river by the operations of the mill. Wastewater outfalls. This is a picture taken by Clancy Gordon, who was who created the environmental studies program here on campus, showing wastewater directly being discharged into the Clark Fork. But then these are some of so the waste pond had to be built after the mill was the mill was built. The wastewater was going directly in, but that was creating harm. So they built the berms, which was just scraping up the land on the floodplain into berms. So it's not a non-engineered berm. And immediately there was discoloration found in the river. So I wanted to just talk about the water and how much it's been used for this mill operation. So Larry Weeks, who worked at the mill for a very long time, wrote a document, or he was an author of a document that talked about that at the time, and the mill was charged 1 penny per 1,000 gallons of water used, and that they used approximately 7 billion gallons of water per year. So we've been talking about comparisons. So this can fill 9 football stadiums. So imagine Grizzly football stadium filled to the brim 9 times, and that's the amount of water used in 1 year. So it was approximately 371 billion gallons of water used over the lifetime of the mill. Talking about production, 1,150 tons per day of product resulted in the discharge of over 20 million gallons per day of wastewater. And so over the life of the mill, it's like 1 billion gallons of wastewater that could fill 515 stadiums. So it's not small amounts of water that's been impacted by this production over time. It's quite significant. One term that continually gets brought up, even the PRPs that were at the county commissioners meeting recently, continued to suggest only 6% of our production was bleached, which creates dioxins, which creates other contaminants of concern. Only 6%, they say. But, so 1 year, 54,000 tons of bleached pulp was produced. Over the life of the mill, the 39 years that the mill bleached, that's approximately 2 million or more tons of waste or bleached pulp, which could fill 3,954 football stadiums. So that's 6%. That's that little number they try to say, but it's a much bigger impact that I think the community really needs to understand. Again, getting into how much water was consumed for just the bleached pulp, 2,700,000 gallons per day of water was used for the bleached pulp. 985 million gallons per year, and approximately 38 billion gallons of water used for that 39 years of just the bleach pulp. So it's as a community member, I do want to understand what's been happening and what is the real life impact that's going on. To say, oh, 6%, that's only 6%, is disingenuous. So Clancy Gordon, this is a picture of Clancy Gordon and a colleague at the foam that was coming out of the river. And this led to him and others leading the charge to say, we need to protect this river. So the Clark Fork Coalition was born. Environmental policies were created that directly influenced what could be done at that mill site. So this is a picture Peter Nelson shared, I apologize, of the site looking, so when you see the June 2011, that's the Clark Fork River. So, there's dump, sludge, wastewater. And according to Peter Nielsen, this could be up to 15 feet deep. Again, significant, 3,200 acres of land. This is just a picture showing, so again, that July, right after the mill opened, there were 33 concentrations of dead fish between the waste outlet and the mouth of Fish Creek. The fish kill was evident that the mill operation had impacted and degraded the conditions of the ecosystem enough to no longer support all of the species it had before the mill began operation. Species of dead fish included cutthroat trout, rainbow trout, and a species no longer found in this stretch of the Clark Fork River, the peamouth trout. So this river is no longer supporting all of the fish. Bull trout is also another species not supported. This is from URS, the EPA's investigation of 2012. Soil samples of the sludge ponds, emergency spill ponds, and wastewater holding ponds at the site confirmed contaminants including dioxins and furan congeners, and metals including manganese, arsenic, and lead. Dioxins, furans, and metals including manganese and arsenic were also detected in shallow groundwater samples at the site, indicating a lack of containment of the contaminants. Some of these compounds were detected in 53 groundwater wells at concentrations above drinking water standards. So again, evidence that the site is impacted. This was a picture from the Missoulian, I don't think I have it cited, but of when in the 1990s there was a new waste regulations. So they went to the site and they found that there was waste in groundwater. And so they were no longer able to continue to fill the waste. They weren't formally dumps. They were just where the garbage was going. But what they did was put soil on top. I forget the depth of soil on top, but there's nothing lining those waste receptacles. It's nothing preventing the waste from interacting with groundwater on site. So in 2009, President Obama did recognize that that we've failed to include tribal voices in these Superfund processes. And without that, the results have been impacted. They have been negative results because they haven't been fully cleaned. So consultation is a critical ingredient of a sound and productive federal-tribal relationship. And these environmental standards set by non-tribal governments have permitted depletion and contamination of tribal resources with grave consequences for tribal members' health and the right for tribes to exercise their collective rights to their resources. This is just that currently there is a Confederated Station Kootenai Tribes Fish Consumption Advisory on the Clark Fork and some of the tributaries based on the data found during some of the investigations. So the community advisory group has impacted the processes. We, though we're not formally part of, of the voice, we have continually raised concerns and questions and asked about processes. And Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in 2013 had done some fish sampling, some fish tissue sampling in the area and found dioxins and PCBs. When they wanted to retest, they found barriers. They weren't able to sample. They didn't get approval from the EPA or the DEQ. We did have Senator John Tester, who was the senator at the time, helped advocate for this sampling in 2017 and 18. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks were able to go out and do a full fish sampling because the tribes shared and articulated that it's a full, you eat the entire fish. And so the fatty tissues are where a lot of these contaminants will reside and bioaccumulate. So when they did that, they found higher levels of PCBs and dioxin furans, and I won't read this whole thing, but are unsafe for consumption. And so they advise just do not consume across this land. And there's, CSKT has their website that has all of this information on it for everyone. So I'll just go past this. I did want to talk about why this matters. I fear that what I'm hearing is waste in place. Waste in place. It's too expensive to remove the contaminants, so we're just going to keep them here. But what we're finding just upriver, this was on a news story just the other day, that Butte Silver Bowl residents die from heart disease and cancer at higher risks, and 10% of babies are being born underweight. I mean, that to me is a sign of environmental crisis that, again, waste in place has been one of the many remedies in that site led by the EPA. I think that we need to pay attention to those things. Often when talking about risk, they'll talk about cancer risk, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000. But what's not talked about are endocrine disruption diseases or reproductive issues. I think the community deserves to know all of the risk involved with all of the remedy choices. Yes, legal does not necessarily mean safe, and legal limits for contaminants in just tap water have not been updated in up to 20 years. I mean, it's just the best way to ensure clean tap water or clean water is to keep the pollution out of the water. Arrowstone Park is another example of waste in place that is failing, that there are now slickens and that the human health and the environment are at risk by this remedy choice. So I think it's good, again, for the community to be informed and understand all of the potential consequences of these actions. And that's a picture of the slickens at Arrowstone. So I didn't go into the interviews I did with the tribal members on this occasion, but I do want to share Tony Nkoshola, who I was one of my, he helped me with this work. He said, our stories teach us that we must always work for a time when there will be no evil, no racial prejudice, no pollution. When once again everything will be clean and beautiful for the eye to behold. A time when spiritual, physical, mental, and social values are interconnected to form a complete circle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was outstanding. So, a lot of you in the audience probably have the same questions that a lot of us on our working team, and I know I myself had. What can we do? I mean, after all, what we've been hearing all night is that this is a very long process. This is a process that requires a lot of testing, and that despite how long the site has been contaminated, despite how long it's been a Superfund site, we're still only at the remedial investigation stage. Well, the most important thing for us to do now is essentially to be educated, to go to the CAG meetings, to learn about the issue at hand and the causes of it and the effects of it and the risks associated with it. So it may be sort of daunting and kind of hard to stay motivated. I know that's a feeling I myself had throughout this process, but stuff like this is very important, and that's why I'd like to thank all of you again for attending, and that's why I'd like to give everybody the opportunity to ask ourselves and our panelists here especially some questions about the site and the process as a whole.
I'm sorry that I came late, but I just needed just some background information. I grew up down the road from this. It's very much part of our family history. My father was a French-Canadian dairy farming family who became an attorney, and he represented so many of the French-Canadian farmers in the valley who were impacted by not so much the water perhaps, but the pollution, the air pollution that decimated their farms in so many ways. And I'm sorry I'm not up to speed on this, but I'm not even aware of the amount of acreage and also who actually owns this today.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I'm Allie Archer. I'm with the EPA as a project manager, just since you came late, so you know. Thank you for that question. The study area is 3,000 acres. And I know that there was a lot of air emissions and air pollution during its operation, but that hasn't been an ongoing issue in the soil surrounding the site. So they did specific aerial deposition testing and didn't see long-term impacts of any elevated contaminants as a result of that, although it was obviously a huge issue during the operation. And then the current owner is kind of mixed ownership. There's an investment company called M2 Green who has a lot of ownership of different parcels, and then someone who's from Whitefish but lives in Washington named, they have a company called Wakefield Kennedy. So they also own a part of it and are looking to do redevelopment. So it's mixed ownership, but it is private property right now. And then that study area is about 3,000 acres of the former industrial area. And then all of the wastewater treatment systems that were involved in the large amount of groundwater that was used and where the wastewater went. So does that answer? Yeah. There's another question in the back.
Hello. My question done. Seeing as the landmark 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding was rescinded on February 12, 2026 by the EPA, what, if any, are the safeguards in place to prevent the repealment of CERCLA legislation and its authority? And seeing as the repealment of CERCLA would require an act of Congress, which legislators would be key and most important to speak to, and which optical angle would be important and most effective for maintaining its status and legitimacy?
Wow, that is such a great question. I don't think that I'm probably the person to speak to that. That's way above my pay grade and my authority EPA. I will say I haven't heard any concerns around that. Superfund, because we work with responsible parties, we don't use federal taxes as a base. So even during the shutdown, we're usually protected because we have a different source of money that we're using to implement these. And like during COVID and other shutdowns, we're usually able to continue work almost seamlessly because of that. So all I can say is that that's not something I've heard as an employee of EPA being a concern. So I think that's probably where I conclude. Yeah.
Yeah, we're supposed to be facilitating questions. We don't want to be that.
Is it just open?
It has to be more so about how we work in the neighborhood, because I know that we can be different at federal level to work with all of these solving ideas, especially with BLM and, you might, like, Park Service, all being governed by different things, and different criteria versus the USDA, and then they're all under different acts, like FLIPMA versus NIFMA and all of that stuff, and along with tribal sovereignty. How is working with all of those people, like, are you able to hear everybody's voice in? Is everybody's being heard? What are you implementing to make sure that those voices?
So the question, just if you don't hear in the back, is like how to coordinate with all like the state and federal trustees and make sure they're all heard. And I agree. And the CAG is actually going to discuss this Thursday, but there are applicable, relevant, and appropriate requirements. So those are the state and federal regulations that we have to look at when we select a cleanup. And that's where we look at like the Endangered Species Act with Fish and Wildlife Service and different, that like Montana Fish and Wildlife Parks, DNRC, those all really come into play. So if you want to learn directly more about that, that's a great time to go to the CAG this Thursday. At Smurfit, we do have the Frenchtown working group, which right now we're in the characterization phase. So they all sit at the table, but we're looking at work plans and data summary reports. A specific example is the United States Forest Service has property on the site. And so they're working with us to understand when they can get data collected or how they can get what is a data gap for the Forest Service addressed. They have their own authorities under Superfund, but they bring that voice to the table, and then we coordinate on what's the most efficient way to look at that property. With CSKT and the Kalispel tribe, during our human health risk assessments, we do specific tribal health consumption advisories. So we worked with CSKT Tribal Council and their science liaison under the legal department to develop fish consumption advisories specific to CSKT. And Jen mentioned it, but we were looking at fillets, and then through consultation with CSKT, started looking at whole body, because that's how fish were being consumed, and it's a more protective look at how to look at the whole fish. So there are a lot of different touch points, but the working group is where we really convene everyone who has a role or a say through their different authorities and try to look at common ground and how we can have efficiencies through the process. That is very long.
Well, sorry. I was wondering, I have two questions, but my first question is there like a immediate plan of action for if/when these like pools do flood over? Is there like for the people that do live like directly in Frenchtown or like here in Missoula, like what happens if like it flooded over like right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for flooding, Brianna mentioned this, but we have a contingency plan in place during this characterization phase. So we sampled the berms, we've sampled what's behind the berms to understand what could be impacted with any cleanup action in flooding events. So when we start evaluating cleanups, that's when we really look at long-term impacts from flooding. But in the interim, we do have a contingency plan where starting in April, the responsible parties are required to inspect the berm monthly, and then the EPA or the state will provide oversight. And we're looking for erosion, animal burrows, cracks, are there any changes in water level? So we're investigating the berms every month. If the Clark Fork rises to a certain level, we go out weekly. And if it rises more than that, we go out daily. And those are all kind of built into the contingency plan. We have a call down list, which includes the CAG and Missoula County. And then we also have contingency measures in place. So we have subcontractors in agreement with the responsible parties to go out there and have sandbagging or do like heavy machinery work in case there is any boiling, which is what happened in 2018. Actually, the Clark Fork pushed up into the site's ponds. And so we put material down to stop that erosion. But we're out there frequently. We send updates through the listserv on where the river's at, what the reports are saying. And during that season at the CAG, we're there regularly providing updates to the CAG too.
I also want to add that I know some of the photos did show those ponds full of water, and it alluded that maybe that was waste and chemicals in those ponds, but there isn't currently anything in those ponds. It was mostly water. It's all infiltrated at this point, and we are seeing our contamination is a lot closer to the site. So I think one of those figures showed where the flood path would potentially be, and we don't see a lot of contaminants in that area. It's primarily further close to the site.
Yeah, there is an outer berm and an inner berm, so that's really great to know. And a lot of the landfills, solid waste basins, primary wastewater treatment is within the inner berm. which is over a mile from the river in some places. So there is that second barrier of protection. But again, they are dry and there's no active discharge since the site has been closed for over a decade. 2010, yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Way in the back?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you all for that great presentation. It's overwhelming. I saw reference to the record of decision, and I'm assuming that there's been or will be a DEIS and an EIS before we get to the record of decision, or have we already passed that phase? And then there's work plans that are now being developed. So you would think that, all of that sequential steps would have been accomplished. So that's like one question I have. And then Jen mentioned, that when those berms were built, they were just kind of, just pushed up. Are they sealed now? Are they, has any remediation begun just to kind of safeguard from further damage at this point while we're waiting for everything, all the steps to be completed?
Sounds like you have a background in environmental investigation, because I think EIS is an environmental impact statement, and I actually am not sure what DIS is.
Draft.
Okay, thank you. So I think specific for Superfund, we do a remedial investigation and a feasibility study, and those are probably pretty similar to an environmental impact statement, where the remedial investigation says what and where are the contaminants located and what risk is occurring as a result of that contamination. So that's a report that we're developing right now and should be finalized this year. Then we take those risks and those contaminants and we look at a feasibility study where we present, here are different alternatives for how to clean it up. And then after we present all the alternatives, there's a formal public comment period. We release a cleanup decision called the record decision. So it is very sequential, and we're in that remedial investigation right now where we're going to put out a report on all the investigations, all the contaminants we sampled for, where they're located, how much of them is there, and then what type of risk is posed from that. Then we'll move into how we're going to clean it up, and we'll be working with the stakeholders and the community through that phase. Their berms are in every phase of that, but right now we've sampled for them. They are natural materials, so they are just, there's no contaminants in them. They were just material pushed up, so we sampled them. And as far as their final role at the site, that will be determined with the cleanup decision. Are they going to remain? If so, in what way? Are they going to be removed? All that will be dictated in the cleanup decision once we've determined how we're going to leave the site in its final state to protect human health and environment in the long term.
But is that Frenchtown group already looking at work plans? That is
not for final cleanups. We're looking at work plans to complete investigation of what type of contamination is out there. It's a 3,000 acre site with a lot of different areas. So there's no work plans on, there's work plans on how to investigate the berms and oversee them during flooding, but no final work plan. But there are a bunch of work plans like geotechnical studies, overtopping analysis on the berms themselves. So they're not engineered, but they have a lot of engineering studies that have done on them, and those are available on the website.
And Jen, I think she mentioned that there was no lining underneath. Is there a lining now or not yet? Is it leaching?
Yeah. Yes. So the waste basins were never lined, and then the sludge ponds and holding ponds were designed to infiltrate into groundwater and move water into the Clark Fork that way. So it's always been interacting groundwater to Clark Fork River. And then we have monitoring wells located down gradient to understand, are there contaminants moving from those waste basins toward the Clark Fork River?
Okay.
Yes.
I'll stand up so that I can see you guys. I believe that one part of Superfund is to consider what the wishes of the community are, that there has to be community acceptance. That's an important part of it. And I've certainly heard over the years that people want the river to have its floodplain back again. And so I'm hoping that will be one of the important criteria, whether it's a combination of removal, in situ bioremediation, or whatever, but that the ultimate goal is to clean up the old floodplain enough to be able to remove the dikes and let the river have its floodplain back. Because it will take it back someday, whether we like it or not. And so I think it's just very, that our role is to clean it up enough so that when the river, whether we remove the dikes and let the river have it, or the river removes the dikes and takes its floodplain back, that by the time that happens, we've cleaned it up enough that we're not just sending a lot of toxins to the people downstream. And the other thing I wanted to suggest was that the floodplain be the first part you start working on, because it is the most at-risk area. So it's like everything doesn't have to be done at once. The Upper Clark Fork, we didn't do everything at once. We tried to work on the most risky places first, deal with them first. And I think that needs to be done at this site also. The floodplain is the riskiest area. We need to address it first and get that done, and then we can take more time on the rest of the site. So those are my suggestions.
Thank you, Vicki. And I would say your first suggestion looks a lot like how public comment is considered. So in our proposed plan public meeting, we ask for folks to stand up and provide formal public comment, and there's a court reporter there. And so that was a great example of how to give a great public comment on a selected cleanup. I think on the floodplain, I just want to reiterate that we are seeing most of the contamination. So when we're talking about addressing the riskier or higher contaminant areas, those are located closer to the industrial area with the primary sludge and the landfills. The outer holding ponds, they received a lot of treated holding ponds over the years, and we have sampled them, but they don't have a lot of elevated levels of contaminants compared to the waste basins and primary sludge ponds. So just wanted to address that concern too.
They're not as toxic, but they're more at risk to be
for flooding.
moved for flooding.
Yes. Nope, I hear you.
What about Pond 17?
Pond 17, yeah, it's where we have some dioxin furans. It received ash from the boilers, and so it's consistent with where we would find contamination related to the former bleaching operations. And Pond 17 is there a map up that we could pull from the presentation? It's located really close to the industrial area. So ponds 3, 4, 17, and 5 were the primary treatment ponds when they first started operating. So it received waste early on. It's really located adjacent to the industrial area behind the inner berm. You can go to that first.
Yeah, there we go.
I think, but this is a good one. So here's the Clark Fork River and the outer berm. Here's the former industrial area. This is the. Where's Missoula? It's not on the screen. But which way?
Which direction is it?
I was like, it's not.
Yeah.
Missoula's over this way.
Okay.
So you're driving east out on I-90, and you can hit Frenchtown, past the fire hall, and continue out to the site on Mullen Road. And then you enter the site right where the former industry was happening. So you have all the old buildings, zombie apocalypse. Jack, you had a great picture of what it looks like now. So the buildings are all kind of falling down. You drive through the site, and this is where wastewater treatment started happening. Here's the clarifier. This is Pond 3, and this is Pond 17. And then we have solid waste basins here and emergency spill ponds. So this is really the heart of the wastewater treatment area. And then water was filtered out over the years to the outer holding ponds, where it waited to meet temperature and color requirements, and then was ultimately discharged under permitted discharge to the Clark Fork River. But again, the site began in 1957. There were many years and decades prior to environmental regulations where things were discharging. And that's why we looked for all those types of contaminants in the floodplain as well as in the primary treatment areas.
Are those the same that aren't, that MTV currently
I think he owns all of the primary sludge ponds.
Can you, as long as you're up there, I think it's important to understand that early in the process, there were 3 areas, OU1, OU2, and OU3. And OU1 was the agricultural land that was not impacted, and it's probably, I believe it's about 1,200 acres, 1,065-ish.
Amazing.
And then OU2 is the industrial, which is about 165 acres, which we know is going to be the most contaminated. That's a given. And so a lot of the study areas have been around those 165 acres. And then the rest is OU3, which is right down in the,
It's all the
area.
surrounding.
So that is 1,500 acres?
Yeah.
So we have broken it out into those three sections. So OU1 is ag land, and we don't feel like there's going to be contaminants there, but where OU2 and OU3 are is where predominantly the study areas have and are being looked at, and it continuing to evolve into testing and data review.
And then they are, on this fact sheet or online too, the EPA will break out large sites into operable units just to make it more manageable based on previous use or geography. And so there's a little explanation here on the operable units, because that will come up if you start reading the documents a lot. So if you want to see them broken out a little with more clarity.
So originally, you guys said you how there's no contaminants in the ponds that are within that floodplain. And then you mentioned how there are not as many contaminants as there are in the ponds closer to the industrial site. I'm wondering if you feel that there's no risk or concern of the contaminants being brought downstream if there were to be a flood.
So I think where we are seeing the most contamination is in the shallow aquifer beneath the site, so in the groundwater. And that's from all the decades of pulp being placed into this, creating a reducing atmosphere and allowing metals to become more present in that shallow aquifer. So there is contaminated groundwater underneath the site for largely manganese and arsenic. We also have some areas that exceed for dioxin furans for the state standard. And we know that groundwater moves toward the Clark Brook River, and the berms aren't stopping that groundwater for interacting with the Clark Brook River. For soil data, we know that Pond 17 has some of the higher dioxin furan data and some of the other primary sludge ponds because they received that primary waste. And they received historic waste prior to the clarifier coming on board once we had all those water and air regulations come into place. And there are some residual contaminants in the outer holding ponds. But I think the berm is quite big. We have responses in place to protect the site from the Clark Brook River if there is flooding. And these contaminants are much more spread out and much less in level than what we see in the primary sludge ponds. But ultimately, it is the groundwater that we're, as a CAG working group, working hard to understand the mechanisms by which it's attenuating or not into the Clark Brook River. So what levels are we seeing in the Clark Brook to inform what type of cleanup we could do to address that. So the remedial investigation and feasibility study can be iterative. So we're constantly studying different transects, different zones within the Clark Brook River and the groundwater, how they interact to understand how we can address that large groundwater area for making its way to the Clark Brook River. That is mostly for manganese and arsenic. And then just to reassure you that we don't see impacts outside of the site to groundwater. So there are no ones drinking the shallow aquifer underneath the site. We don't see impacts outside of the site boundaries. So there are no private users of this water that are being impacted, but it is an issue at Smurfit Stone, and as federal and state agencies, we're required to clean that water up or address that water as if it could be used as drinking water in the future. So it's not a problem for Frenchtown or residents, but it needs to be addressed as if it could be used as drinking water in the future, even though it's not right now. That helps. I feel like every question you have to kind of give a long background because it's been many years of study. Yeah.
This issue is recovering.
I was wondering, I think in like some of the pictures that we saw, and we talked about how there's no lining for the waste. Is all of that waste like still just sitting there? And is it possible for like, I don't know if it can't be removed physically, like for like studying reasons, or it just like is physically not safe to bring outside of the zone. but would it be possible for like, you know how this is like very, very light comparison, but like people will do roadside cleanup. Like, is it possible for community members to go in and potentially like take some of this like waste out, or is that not?
No, I feel like you need a future career in Superfund. You're already thinking through like, how do we clean it up and how can we get people involved? It's easier at fund lead sites where we've gone out and helped to plant trees to stabilize a slope before, where we look to community. So I think that's a great question. For the contaminants at Smurfit, we're tracking the groundwater level and at what amount it's interacting with the bottom of those basins. And then we have the monitoring wells kind of understanding the contaminant movement from those basins. But what the larger issue really is like the decades of pulp that's been placed there. And so that's causing a much bigger issue with the metals than those landfills actually and their interaction with groundwater. So we do have some elevated actin furans and other contaminants leaving those. But what's a larger issue is the holding ponds and the sludge ponds that are keeping pulp in place and allowing those metals to remain elevated. So I think we're going to keep looking at, are there removals that would help reduce contaminants? That's really the next phase. So I think that's a great question. We're starting to look at that as we move from remedial investigation to feasibility study. But a larger issue is really all of the sludge that still remains from the trees.
And I'm going to add something to that too. Keep in mind, I mean, when we do highway cleanup, that's a public area. This is a privately owned piece of ground. And so the public, we can't go on there. We have to get special permission. It's a locked gate still. There's no way for the public to go out there and have a tree planting party, whatever. It's still, it's private. So you have to really keep that in mind when we talk about those things.
So it was mentioned that something about PCBs, and I'm wondering if those have been found, where they've been found, what the original source might have been, and if there's any understanding about their movement off the site.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think also, because there's been a lot of talk about fish consumption and concern around fish consumption in the Clark Fork River. The Fish Consumption Advisory is a state of Montana directive, and that's not specific to Smurfit. It's specific to the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot and those tributaries. So that's a good differentiation of, we have risk assessments where we also look at the protectiveness of consuming fish, but the Consumption Advisory is developed separately and is not developed specific to Smurfit. We did look at total PCBs and dioxin furans as they were potentially associated with the former operations. PCBs weren't used in the paper and pulp mill process outside of just having a lot of hydraulic oils on site. So they were found in the industrial area in 2018, and there were removal actions to address elevated PCBs within the former industrial areas. They were associated with a former transformer storage area, which is known to have PCBs, and then another area that looks like it was associated with a hydraulic spill. We did study them more in depth, and we see them in trace amounts under the site in the groundwater. They're not exceeding a state or federal groundwater drinking water level, but we know there's movement of them toward the Clark Fork River. We also can look at other studies that have been done by Fish Wildlife Parks and Trout Unlimited and understand that there are other potential sources within the Clark Fork River outside of Smurfit. So I think we have seen them in some of the former landfills and sludge ponds through additional boreholes that we're looking at. We see them in low amounts in the groundwater moving toward the Clark Fork River. And so part of understanding if we need to remove dumps or not, we'll be looking at, would that have an effect on reducing PCB movement to the Clark Fork River? But they are, I think, comparative to other national and state PCB sites, relatively low levels.
So can I ask a follow-up question then? So where did the removals that had PCBs go? And
yes.
What, can you be more specific about other sources of PCBs in the basin?
For Smurfit or in the Clark Fork Basin?
In the upstream.
I know that there are additional studies that are being developed. I really am on Smurfit Stone.
You're laser focused.
Yeah, that's my laser focus. The removals, there is a fact sheet on the PCB removals and reports online. They were like a couple hundred cubic yards at Smurfit, and they went to the Missoula Republic landfill.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess I just want to say something about the
the PCBs, the CAG and the stakeholders really had to fight to get congeners and aerochlors. I mean, there was limited study on PCBs on the site. And we, I think, as a community, really pushed towards a more comprehensive study. And that led to more discovery.
I grew up in the Butte Anaconda region, so I'm very familiar with how Superfund sites operate, and especially some of the remedial efforts that have been done, with consequences that have permeated since before I was born, and which I will continue to live with the rest of my life. I was wondering which sort of remedial options exist for this particular site, including waste in place and capping, and some of the potential consequences that result from those.
Can I tell you to come to a future CAG meeting or EPA public meeting? Because we will develop a list of a range of alternatives. We always look at no action just as a basis for departure. So there'd be a no action, that's a required consideration. And then there could be 9 to 20 different ones, looking at all the different ways you can address these. So I would say, just as like a teaser, you should definitely stay involved, and that will be something that we're going to be discussing at length once we get to that stage, which should be in the next year or two.
We're currently in the RI phase where we're defining what our risks are, and then the next step will be how are we going to address those.
Okay, so you talked about how the contaminant that is for water. Is there a chance that that could
Yeah, so in the soils. So the question was, we are looking at contamination in the groundwater. Is there a chance that could infiltrate into the aquifer? And Missoula is very unique and cool that it has a sole source aquifer designation. And that's the deep aquifer that is beneath a lot of this area. I don't actually know the full extent, but I know it's beneath Smurfit Stone as well. So we do have deep wells at the site looking at impacts to the deep aquifer. And we do see some manganese elevated above, I would say, like a naturally occurring background at that level, but that's really the only contaminant that we've seen make its way into the soil source. So we're looking at the soil source. We know that's a protected area. And we have seen, like, something that we should keep an eye on as we move forward is manganese having an impact down there, because we do see levels of manganese come back in some of those wells. Yeah.
So we're talking a lot about fish consumption advisories, and I was wondering, does the EPA plan on continuing to test fish around the Smurfit Stone site? Because I know that the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Fish Consumption Advisory does not specifically mention Smurfit Stone as a cause of fish consumption advisory. Is there any plan in the future to determine whether Smurfit Stone conclusively should contribute to that advisory? And is there a plan in place to continue testing fish downstream of the site?
Yeah, I think where we're at right now is we have fish data that shows unacceptable levels, and that's what we need for the RI. So at this phase, there wouldn't be any change because we know it's unsafe to consume the fish. I can't speak to if that's going to be a part of our monitoring going forward as a part of any potential cleanups. So I'm going to leave all that on the table because I think we don't have a cleanup. That might be something that needs to happen, is fish sampling downstream. Fish are mobile, and we've used a lot of different methods to better hone in on potential sources. So at Smurfit, we have groundwater, surface water, sediment pore water, benthics, dace, different types of fish. And then I think for the fish consumption advisory, when you look at the extent of it, and it starts at the Blackfoot, way upstream of, where Smurfit comes in to the Clark Fork River and includes way downstream, I think there, as we said earlier, a lot of discussions about additional source characterization, and we'll be looking at how do we minimize and reduce any impacts from any contaminant to the Clark Fork River, including PCBs and other risk drivers. So that's kind of where we're at in the process of making sure our site isn't adversely affecting the Clark Fork and its inhabitants and folks who consume those things. And so we'll look at potential monitoring if it isn't a part of any of those cleanup decisions.
Well, how can we make this process better, though? I mean, I know that when we've talked about the fish consumption advisory, the EPA, you've always said, well, that it might be somewhere else. Instead of just even a moment of saying, well, maybe it is from here and we should find out. But I find it's been deflective, like, oh, because it was up the black book, but you have already stated fish are mobile and they move. I guess I'm not saying that that couldn't be a possibility, but I would love in this process if there was some pause and say maybe there is a chance that it is contributing to the impacts to fish.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think that is what we are doing, is we are acknowledging that that is a potential. The data hasn't really been, like, we've been looking at the groundwater, we've looked at the soil, we haven't found any sources, but I do think it has been looked at.
What? Thank you. And I think to add on to that, Jen, like when you talk about the, 6%, like words do have meaning. And so I think that's important feedback for us, is what you're hearing is that word deflective. When I feel like us acknowledging, like the CAG brought and Missoula County and stakeholders, we want to see total PCBs included. And so by us investigating total PCBs in a very meaningful and comprehensive way, that's us acknowledging that's a great idea. We didn't look at total PCBs when the site was first listed, and we know that there's a fish consumption advisory. Let's acknowledge that it could be from here. Let's go dig deeper. And so I think that's just good feedback. I'm not trying to be deflective. I just don't want us to have a narrow lens when there is other data. And I want all groups who are passionate about it to advocate for everyone to be doing that good of a look in that part of a search to make sure we get the Clark work to a usable space. But I didn't need to be deflective, so I think that's good feedback.
Well, so I'm not quite certain I understand. So do we have all of the data to conclusively say that, because you're talking about how we have the data to prove that the fish and quantities of PCBs and other contaminants in fish downstream of Smurfit Stone
and upstream
and upstream, because fish are mobile, can prove that there's unacceptable levels of contaminants. So do we have that data now, or do we need to dig deeper? And also regarding the aquifer, you said earlier tonight that the aquifers are not, that the groundwater there does not endanger the aquifers, but then later on you said that there is a higher than naturally occurring level of manganese in the aquifers, and that's just something I worry about, because every time I go into the CAG meetings at the Frenchtown firehouse, there's a big sign, your aquifer below, and it just makes me a little curious about that.
Yeah, okay, a couple questions were in there.
Yeah.
So we have fish data that was collected as a part of the site that shows fish have unacceptable levels of PCBs and dioxin purines in them.
Yes.
The Smurfit Stone site team investigated for those contaminants on our site, and there doesn't seem to be a significant source that would be the sole contributor that would allow for that 114-mile stretch of Clark River having a fish consumption advisory. Yes, fish are mobile, but we have all of that other data. Groundwater to surface water to pore water to dace to benthics through the cumulative chain. Not to say that there might not be an action for us to look at, do more to protect what's coming from the site, but we wanted to communicate that there's been additional passive sampling devices collected in the Clark Fork that have indicated other sources upstream, along with the lack of a huge source indicator at our site. We did do PCB removals underneath the transformer storage area, but we haven't seen another removal of those contaminants that would improve water quality making its way. So I think it is like a very nuanced thing of, yes, fish are unsafe to eat, and yes, our site team has been studying that, and we don't see a large source that would be impacting the Clark Fork to that extent. So it's kind of a call to action to those other groups who are involved and engaged to make sure that we're keeping not, blinders on to the other potential impacts. That's not my job. Mine is Smurfit Stone, cleaning that up. We're going to be working on that. And then next, I'm not sure, we can clarify, but the shallow aquifer is the groundwater that we see a lot of the impacts in. And so I didn't mean to not say the aquifer doesn't experience impacts. It is specific to that area because the contaminants are mobilized under these reducing conditions, which is where the sludge has been placed and allowed no oxygen to occur. Once it moves outside of the site's footprint, you don't see those metals in that same way because of some chemical transitions that allow them to settle out. So it is unique to underneath the Smurfit site in that shallow aquifer. We don't see impacts outside of the footprint of the site. And we can see with our data that we see it most elevated under the former sludge ponds and holding ponds, and then we see it not as prevalent outside of that area. So it's the shallow aquifer under the footprint of the site, and that also the deep aquifer under the footprint of the site we're studying.
Yeah.
After all that, thank you for being here and everything and explaining all this. I do appreciate it. Have there been a success story, like another site that is as whatever this is? Have you done something else somewhere else so we can be a little bit hopeful, or we can?
Yeah, I mean, I would be hopeful now. I think the CAG has advocated for changes in the process that have been done by the agencies. You do have a voice in this process. I think there have been micro successes of additional sampling. We're getting to the remedial investigation report. We have our risk assessments, but I think like there is such passion and expertise in Missoula and Frenchtown around this site that it feels like a lot sometimes, but I think it's a success in that we all come together, they come together monthly, regularly. We convene a technical work and we get input, and there's that two-way discussion. And you have a university group who's hosting, and you all here tonight who are interested. So I think those are the successes, is that people care and we want to do the right thing. And then Superfund as a whole, I think there are various successes in. I was going to say, Full mills in general, they get cleaned up. Yeah, full mills have been cleaned up. Superfund sites have been delisted. There is an end to this, and I think it's the marathon, not the sprint kind of mentality. And engage when you have the energy to do it, because we'll always be here. So ask questions too.
And so I know you mentioned that you guys have these meetings. They're different from the CAG meetings, but you have these meetings at the brewery. Are all stakeholders invited to that? What is the difference, and why do you guys have a separate meeting? And can the public come to that? Like what?
Oh, of course, yeah. They're publicly noticed, publicly available, and they're just informal. We get super basic questions a lot of the time. People just want a little progress update. What the heck's going on with those buildings? Why are they still up? When are you guys going to move forward on the site? So it's just an opportunity, one more opportunity, and sort of a suite of offerings that we like to present to communities. So it's not just one single way that you can interact. And if you don't feel like, doing that on one night, then maybe you'll feel that you've missed out on something. So that's why we like to provide opportunities like those informal conversations, like fact sheets, like newsletters, like phone calls.
It's something we've done like in Butte and other areas where we just offer like an open house or like a Q&A like this, where if you want to come and ask questions but don't feel like you have to. I think the CAG's also a great place for that, but if you want to pull us one-on-one, that's a way to answer questions. And then the difference is we don't provide any presentations or like technical outreach there. We're really just there to answer what's on people's hearts and minds. And then the CAG is really where you can go for all of the stakeholders to convene, and where EPA will come and provide our updates and technical presentations and talk through process. So I think it is very separate, and it's something that's worked in Butte and other communities across Montana. So thought we'd bring it here, and it's slowly getting off the ground. But
And then another question: when was your guys' last site visit, and were all stakeholders present?
Yeah, I know a little bit since I've been out on site.
In September, October, we had quite a few of the stakeholders out on site because we had a congressman who wanted to visit as well. So, yeah.
And do you guys regularly attend the CAG meetings?
If we have an upcoming data summary report or work plan, we make sure that we get on the CAG's agenda to provide an update. Or like they have ARRs with the state of Montana coming down. So if there's a topic like a Superfund 101, we're happy to go. But I think we're working on making sure we provide meaningful outreach and good presentation. So as soon as we have an update, they're our first place we go to provide that technical update. But it is sometimes, I think we're there in December, and then it's a couple months between DSRs. So we're looking to hopefully go in April or May.
Yeah. I just had a question about the role of responsible parties. Do they get a say in the end-all be-all when it comes to Superfunds? And do they get a say in a lot of this? And if they do, why do they get a say instead of just listening and doing what they're told?
I mean, I think it's personalities of responsible parties too, and who they're reporting to, but they do get a say because they are experts in the former process, and they have environmental firms working. So we sit down in the state of Montana and look at the site. Ultimately, they don't get the final say. So they can advocate for something, they don't get the final say. EPA is the one who writes a record decision. we do negotiate a consent decree for that cleanup. But yeah, they're at the table. They can bring some expertise that we can consider or not. But I feel like we're open to hearing, from our working group and from the PRPs, but they don't get the final say.
I will say they do work with a consulting group that is local to Missoula, with GSI, so a lot of the people who are out there doing the sampling are Missoula residents.
Oh,
a question in the back.
Hi, another long question, sorry. In accordance to Part 9 of the Montana State Constitution, labeled Environment and Natural Resources, subsection 1, labeled Protection and Improvement, subheadings 1, 2, and 3, if you'd like I can read those, but I'll read the necessary parts. State, and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations, under subsection 1, and subsection 3, or subsection 2, which is that the legislature shall provide for the administration and enforcement of this duty, and subsection 3, that the legislation shall provide adequate remedies for the protection of environmental life support systems for degradation and provide adequate remedies to prevent unreasonable depletion and degradation of natural resources. So seeing as a state is bound to its constitution, is this what's considered state compliance? It has been 15 years since it was declared a Superfund site. Is there anything that could expedite this process at all? Is there anything tying the state besides the Constitution to preventative measures? It's violating the Constitution.
Are you a law student?
No.
I was like, I think, I hear you, and it does take a long time, and a lot of it is looking at levels over different seasons. We had the lowest groundwater on site, we've seen the highest groundwater on site. That has impacted some of the contaminant levels. So I think we're being as fast as we can with the input and kind of bringing our team along and the community along with us. So if there is an immediate risk, like harm to human healthy environment, EPA can do emergency responses. The site doesn't have data that supports an emergency response. So I think that's important to note too, is we don't have a need for an emergency response. The state's role is providing meaningful input on all of the steps, and we have to have meaningful input with the community and stakeholders. And then it's a 3,000 acre site with a lot of various contaminants and a huge history pre-regulation. So I think it is a lot to investigate, and we want to do a thorough job uncovering all of the stones to make sure we're looking for the right things.
I understand that and appreciate your answer. I have a quick follow-up question. Has there been any efforts in the past to bring this to the Montana legislature?
I was going to add that. I should have said this. So the Montana legislature did form an environmental quality council where they had Smurfit Stone as an area of interest. And so they looked into the sampling that was done today. It was actually Brianna's first day on the job was the EQC meeting, so I'll always remember it. But so they have taken a lot of interest in it. They attend the CAG meetings, the representatives from that area. So they're at the CAG meetings, they're advocating for both involvement from the community and like efficient use of our time. But I feel like they have been supportive of doing additional sampling, looking for total PCBs. So I don't feel like we're at risk of violating the Constitution right now because they're on board. We're updating them with what's happening.
They did a House joint resolution, 18. So it is an actual resolution that is making sure that the Constitution is not violated. And it is making sure that all of it's just really making sure that the process is followed. And that's what that joint resolution has done. We spoke at it, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, where members of the K, John Harrison, Elena was there, John Harrison was there from CSKT. We hear from them regularly about what's happening, if we have concerns as a CAG. So I feel like that HJ 18 really does ensure that the Constitution is being followed.
Mm-hmm. And then a final question on that behalf. I'm reading through the House resolution right now. Has there ever been anything introduced into legislation or as an idea of, say, you said it was privately owned land, a buyback for a federal interest or state interest?
No.
And you said there was a developer that owned land.
So it follows liability.
Okay.
So, for example, M2 Green owns a big portion of the most contaminated area of the 3,200 acre site. They own a little over 174 acres. it's all in the contamination area of the one of OU2. And so whoever buys that, if you ponied up that $750,000, you now become a PRP. So you're liable now to pay for the cleanup of the site. Nobody wants to do that. So it's best that we follow this process, that we do identify all of the contaminants on the site, and find a way to clean it up so that we do restore it for future generations.
They have to pay the back taxes that he hasn't paid.
They would have to pay, but there is a legislation that Representative Kim Dudek put into place, and I believe it was 2014, where Missoula County can collect on those back taxes without becoming liable and without becoming an owner of that property. And it's highly likely that that will happen soon. They did it before. They owed close to $840,000 that was recouped. Our fire station, our school, our roads, all of that is really impacted from that tax base. When the mill closed in 2010, our community was at great risk because of the tax base that Smurfit Stone paid into our schools, our fire department, all of the things that we as taxpayers had to come up with because of Smurfit not being there anymore. It employed 430 mill workers that made over $80,000 a year with full benefits. It closed in 2010, so let that sink in. $80,000 jobs in 2010. That went away. Those people had homes, they had taxes on their homes. That went away. So our tax base was really impacted in the Frenchtown community. And so we do want to see the site cleaned up for future generations and for whatever it's going to be that will economically impact our community again, but we want it cleaned up. And we're sensitive to how long it's taking, but we don't want to skip steps just to clean it up and say it's clean. We want to make sure that it is a thorough and robust clean, and it does take time, and it is frustrating sometimes. I mean, we've been waiting for 2 years for data. We can't do anything about it. Nobody can. It's the lab. It's what happens. It's super fun, and it is a long and arduous process.
So in terms of potentially responsible parties, what has their involvement looked like? What are some of the things that they've been responsible for so far? What have they accomplished? Because throughout the research we've been doing on this, we've been having kind of a hard time figuring out exactly what the potential responsible parties have actually contributed and accomplished in terms of this, and especially with them being so behind on taxes.
Yeah, so the potential responsible parties, International Paper and West Rock, don't have any property ownership out there. So they don't have back taxes that they are working with. And they're really who are our prime parties that we work with. So International Paper and West Rock, they have a local environmental consulting firm called GSI, and that's who Brianna and I work with to say, hey, we need to develop a work plan on groundwater monitoring for 2026. We want it to include these wells for these contaminants, and we need it in a month. They would then go sit at a desk, put that work plan together, and then provide it to us and our teams for review and approval. So they're really like the unseen workhorse that we direct to do work. They also provide all of the field work teams out there. So they're out there for 2 weeks straight collecting that groundwater data. Brianna and myself or our contractors will go out and oversee them doing it, but we're not pumping the wells, filling the bottles, sending them to FedEx at the end of the day. That's all the responsible parties. We make sure it's done correctly per the work plan and all the quality assurance plans. Then they coordinate with the lab, send all the labs, get all the lab validation reports back. They generate the data summary reports. They send it to us to review and approve, and we review all the validation too. So I would say they really have done all of the work, but it's directed by EPA and DEQ. It's overseen by us, and then we review and approve all of it. But they're kind of like the behind the scenes, paying for everything up front. That's a polluter pays policy. So it's not tax-based, it's not federal government time or money. We are required to direct them, oversee it, and approve it.
Can you mention the AFC? And
Yeah. Yeah, so Jack, you had up there in 2015 is when we first entered into an enforcement agreement called the Administrative Order on Consent, and that's available online too. It's something I also usually bring with me because it's our enforcement agreement for how we require the PRPs to do work. It has stipulated penalties in there if they're not providing work plans on time. It talks about the required documents that go with the remedial investigation report, like the reuse assessment that's going to come out and all of the things that go into an FS. So it's a really good blueprint on how we work with the PRPs, what they're required to provide to us and when. So that's all on there. And that was when we began the remedial process. So prior to 2015, they were in site assessment. 2015 is really when the remedial team came on board, got companies under order, and began the investigation. Per that we negotiated and agreed upon administrative order on consent. And with the AOC, the RI work plan is negotiated and attached to it. So like the very initial remedial investigation work plan is appended to that AOC and has the OU operable units described and site history, all of the different entities that owned and operated it are all. So it is kind of a good history document to pull up.
All right, and I'm afraid that is about all the time we have tonight. Thank you very much to everybody for attending, and thank you very much to our panelists. We're very glad to have you. And if anybody has any further questions, you can ask us, you can ask our panelists, and most importantly, the next CAG meeting is going to be at the Frenchtown Firehouse, 6 to 8 p.m. this Thursday. That is an excellent place to go for questions. Thank you.